1980, a philosopher at the school that trains the French elite strangled his wife. A medical ruling closed the case. There was never a trial. Louis Althusser had spent his career arguing that ideas do not live inside people. They live in buildings, in rituals, and in what you do without deciding. If that is right, examining your own mind searches the wrong room. You can be honest with yourself and come back with nothing, because nothing was kept there. The next 2 hours put that claim on trial, which is more than France ever did. Part 1. The belief you cannot find the beginning of. You spent about 12 years of your life in a room with a clock on the wall. A bell rings and the talking stops without anyone deciding to stop it. You raise a hand to be allowed to speak. You hand something in on a date somebody else chose. A number comes back and nobody has to explain to you that the number is about you. Nothing written on that board was a lie. Long division is simply true. Now take the conviction you would defend hardest today, the one you would still be arguing for at midnight, and try to say when it started. Not what supports it, when it began. There is no day. There is no argument that converted you, no book that turned you around, no conversation you could name as the hinge. You can give reasons for all of it, fluently, and the reasons are good ones. What you cannot produce for any of them is a beginning. The picture behind that failure deserves stating at full strength, because it is a good picture, and most of thinking runs on it. A belief is a content held in a mind. It got in at some moment from a parent, a school, a book, an argument in somebody's kitchen. Because it is content, it can be inspected. You can hold it up, ask what supports it, test it against evidence, and drop it if it fails the test. That is what examining your life actually consists of, and you have done it. You left the religion, or the party, or the plan your family had for you. On this picture, the belief that survives inspection is genuinely yours, because you are the one who checked. Althusser puts one case against that picture, and the case is borrowed. A man is convinced by argument that he ought to believe in God, and finds that he cannot. Pascal's advice in the Wager fragment is to follow the way by which believers began. Act as if you believed, take the holy water, have masses said. Althusser compresses this into what became the most quoted sentence in the theory of ideology. Kneel down, move your lips in prayer, and you will believe. He calls it a scandalous inversion of the order of things. 2 details are worth carrying. Althusser writes that Pascal says this more or less, and the sentence is not in Pascal. Pascal's own verb in the fragment is abetire, which means the practice will make you a beast. The famous version is cheerful about it. The original concedes that the ritual works by dulling you to the level at which the question stops getting asked. So the man kneels every morning for a year, and at the end of the year he believes. Ask when that began, and there is no morning that is the first morning. There was no afternoon of ascent. There is an obvious rescue, and it costs more than it saves. Suppose he believed all along and never knew it. Then the only thing that changed over the year was the kneeling. The belief was there before and after, so it explains nothing about how he ended up a believer. The practice does all the work either way. In 2001, Matthew Lieberman and his colleagues ran a version of this with the year and the church removed. Densely amnesic patients, people who cannot retain what they did 10 minutes ago, went through a standard laboratory choice task. Their attitudes then shifted to match a choice they had no memory of making by as much as healthy controls shifted. There was no inner theatre left in which a belief could have occurred, and the belief occurred anyway. That paradigm has a problem of its own, which is worth offence later on. The second failure of the common sense picture is easier to test because a government tested it. If convictions are contents in heads, then wrong ones should come out when you put right ones in. In 1998, the Netherlands opened a national organ donor registry and ran a large education campaign. It mailed more than 12 million letters in a country of 15.8 million people, asking citizens to register. Johnson and Goldstein reported the outcome in 2003. The effective consent rate did not move. It stayed at about 27%. Austria, which mails nobody and argues with nobody, sits at 99.98%. On the Austrian form, you are a donor already, unless you write in to say otherwise. Nobody in Vienna decided that Austrians should be generous with their organs. There is no argument being won there and nobody to accuse. There is a form. Althusser's first thesis is one sentence, and every word in it is load-bearing. Ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. The word carrying the weight is relationship. What gets represented is not the world. It is your standing toward the world, where you are placed in it, what is owed, what counts as normal, what sort of thing you are. That is why correcting the facts bounces off. 12 million letters can only address somebody's picture of the world, and nobody's picture of the world was ever the item in question. Imaginary here does not mean invented. The relation is entirely real. The number that came back on that paper is the case in point. The number is real, and the ranking it puts you in is real. What is imaginary is the picture of yourself you read off it. The relation is lived as an image you recognize yourself in, not as a claim you could check. The second thesis is the one with teeth. Ideology has a material existence. That does not mean ideas need paper and airtime in order to travel. It means the idea exists nowhere except in an apparatus, in the ritual that apparatus prescribes, and in the practices performed inside it. The mathematics period is the test case for that. Nobody in that room asserted that authority is legitimate or that a person can be summarized by a number. Both were practiced for most of the hours of most of the days for over a decade, at the most formidable age a human being has. And a 15-year-old, who is a convinced anarchist, still hands the essay in on Friday. The convictions were never on the board. They were in the timetable, and the truth of the arithmetic is exactly what made the timetable invisible. Which is why the 2 in the morning question has no answer. You cannot find the day your conviction started because it never started in you. It was practiced into you. Belief is what a practice looks like from the inside. Say that out loud, and it sounds like behaviorism wearing Marx's clothes. Suppose a belief is nothing over and above the practice. Then there is no fact about what someone really thinks that can come apart from what they do. That is plainly false, because people dissent inwardly for years. The priest doubting through the liturgy. The employee who despises the meeting and runs it well. The student who thinks the ranking is rubbish and still turns the paper over to see the number first. Žižek is usually read as pressing the harder version of this. Althusser hands us an outside, the ritual, and an inside, recognition, and then uses Pascal to explain the passage between them. But they remain two things. Something must already be in place for the kneeling to convert into faith rather than into sore knees. The phrase commonly attached to this, in the literature that reports the objection, is belief before belief. By the time you submit to a ritual, you already believe without knowing that you do. On that reading, the materiality thesis stops one step early, and the step it stops before is the one carrying everything. Althusser's reply is not that the inner life is a fiction. His claim is about where ideas exist, and not a claim that nothing is happening inside anybody. There is one case that survives both readings intact. Take the doubting priest again, the one the objection just used. He has lost his faith and goes on saying Mass. The sacraments are valid, the children are baptized, the register fills, the calendar turns, and the collection is counted on Sunday evening. Whatever ideology is, the loss of belief did not interrupt it. Žižek is right that something in the gap is unaccounted for. Althusser is right that the gap was never where the thing had been living. That leaves the move everyone makes next, and it arrives within seconds. If information does not dissolve this, and it did not begin in you, then somebody must have put it there. Find out who benefits. Find the meeting where it was decided. Find the desk. It is the most reasonable next step available, and it is where the whole account is about to come apart. Everyone who has gone looking for that desk has come back without it. Part 2. Nobody is doing this to you. In 1917, the revolution succeeded in the most backward large country in Europe. Russia had a small industrial working class, an enormous peasantry, and an autocracy with no parliament to absorb a shock. Germany and Britain had the developed version of everything Marx had described. Factories, wage labour, organised unions, and the conflict between what a society can produce and who owns the producing at its sharpest anywhere on earth. They did nothing. A theory with a mechanism and a prediction had just been contradicted by the event it existed to explain. Go looking for the desk where your convictions were decided, and this is the country you end up in. The first thought is always that somebody arranged it. Ideology on that picture is a lie told by people who know better, for their own advantage. It is a reasonable thought, and it carries one fatal requirement. The liars have to be standing outside the lie, in the clear, seeing the whole of it plainly enough to design it. Nobody stands there. The people who benefit most from an arrangement are the ones most thoroughly enrolled in it. They work the longest hours inside its rituals and believe its account of merit most sincerely. They are the most invested people in the building rather than the exempt ones. And a conviction is not a content in a head. It is something performed inside a practice. So there is no room off to the side where the designers keep the plans. So the distortion has no author. That sounds like relief for about 4 seconds, until you ask what is left to do the work. Something still has to explain why millions of unrelated actions line up. A whole has to be determining its parts, with no designer and no billiard balls. By 1960, Marxism had exactly two models available for that, and Althusser thought both were borrowed from elsewhere, and both broke. The first model is the one everybody already owns. One thing pushes another, which pushes another, and cause travels forward along a line of contact. It is how a cue ball moves a red one. Applied to a society, it produces economism. The economy shoves, and law and schooling and religion move. The difficulty is that a line of pushes can only ever relate one element to one other element. It cannot express how an arrangement acts on everything inside it at once, which was the thing to be explained. The second model was built to fix precisely that, and Hegel perfected it. Here the whole is present in every part, because every part expresses a single inner principle. The art of an age, its law, its economy and its religion all say the same thing in different materials. That does deliver the power of a whole over its parts. It buys that power by making the whole a spirit, one centre with everything else as its outward phenomena. Every part is only the essence showing itself. So the art of the age cannot change the age. It can only display what the age already was. Nothing inside a whole like that can ever surprise it. Both models share one defect, and it is the same defect wearing two coats. Each gives you a reality at two levels, the real thing underneath and the appearance it throws off on the surface. Althusser wanted a third kind of cause, neither an earlier element nor a hidden essence, and ordinary life is full of them. A shortage is not an object anywhere in the warehouse, and it still empties the shelves. A deadline is not a thing in the room, and everyone in the room is moving faster because of it. The grammar of the language you are speaking is nowhere in the air where the sentence is spoken. Each of those constrains, explains, and can be got wrong about without being an extra item you could remove. Althusser's own image for this is a theatre. A play is running and the script is binding every night, word for word. There is no author's chair, no rehearsal room, no rewrite meeting, no first draft in a drawer. The stage, the script and the actors are the same thing, and the script exists nowhere except in the performance of it. Some of the people are sitting in the seats watching. They are spectators only because they were cast as spectators first, and the casting is part of the script. There is no one to defeat. A structure is not a thing standing behind the arrangement. It is the arrangement, and it exists nowhere but in its effects. Althusser drew the historical consequence in a short note from September of 1966 called On Genesis. For capitalism to exist, three things had to arrive in the same place. Money accumulated in quantities large enough to be advanced as capital. People with nothing to sell but their capacity to work. And a body of technical invention. The roots are the familiar ones from Marx on primitive accumulation, plunder on one side and eviction from the land on the other. Each of those has its own history on its own clock, driven by its own quarrels, and none was aiming at the result. The same element can be produced by completely different roots, so the stripped labourer arrives from several unrelated pasts at once. Which means feudalism is not the father of capitalism. The new order was not sitting inside the old one as a seed, waiting. Three genealogies, with nothing to do with each other, met and took in the way that milk takes or a fire takes. Now go back to Russia in 1917. In the country in 1917 there was peasant land hunger and an army beaten in the field. There was a working class packed into a few enormous plants inside a backward state. There was an autocracy with no parliamentary shock absorber and a collapse of wartime supply. And there was a party of exiles with an organizational form. No item on that list is the cause. The peasants wanted land of their own, which is a demand for private property, not for socialism. That demand fused with the rest anyway. The revolution is what the fusion was, not what some deeper single thing produced. That is what overdetermination means, and it is not the claim that many causes contribute. It is the claim that the basic economic contradiction is never simple, and is never available anywhere in a pure state. It exists only as bent and displaced by the conditions it is supposed to determine. Germany had the same contradiction, further developed, and it stayed in solution. Then what survives of the claim that the economy determines anything? Althusser's answer is narrow and strange. The economy determines which level does the dominating, and dominance can belong to religion or to politics or to the schools. It never does the dominating in person. From the first moment to the last, he wrote, the lonely hour of the last instance never comes. That is not modesty about the evidence. It says there is no state of the world, past or future, in which the economy appears on its own, stripped of everything else, acting. Leszek Kolakowski published the objection to that in 1971, and it has not been answered. Take the last instance and ask what it actually says. Either it has content, and then it tells you the economy really does decide outcomes, which is economism with a hedge standing in front of it. Or it has no content, and then historical materialism has become the observation that many things matter, which nobody denies, and which is not Marxist. Overdetermination gets the same knife. That revolutions happen when many circumstances coincide is a commonplace, and you would struggle to find anyone willing to deny it. Saying it in a heavier vocabulary does not make it a discovery. The second blade goes to hindsight. The charge, as it is usually reported, is that at predicting the past, determinists of every school are formidable. At predicting what has not happened yet, they are exactly as weak as everybody else. There is a reply, and it is the one part of this argument you can feel from the inside. The objection assumes a row of separate factors whose weights we then argue about. That grammar is the thing Althusser denies. Go back to the room with the deadline in it. You cannot weigh the deadline against the people working, because the deadline is not another item on the table. Saying what it is already part of describing the room. The economy is supposed to be like that. There is no separate thing standing off to one side, waiting to be put on the scale against your schooling and your job. Naming it is already part of holding a picture of the whole. Which is why nobody can tell you which force decided your convictions, and it is not because the accounting is hard. There is no separate item to hold up. That comes with a bill, and you are the one who pays it. The weight of each level can only be worked out after the event. So the theory can tell you what has already happened to you, and never what is coming. It never told anyone what to expect on a morning that had not happened yet. Even granting all of it at its strongest, something is missing. An arrangement with no author still has to work through people, one at a time, every morning, in a body that has to get out of bed. The script is binding, and there is nobody backstage enforcing it. The whole thing rests then on the one thing the theatre never shows, the moment an arrangement with no author gets inside a person. Part 3. Why you turn around. When someone shouts, two texts on a table. The first is the French sentence Althusser wrote in 1969, built on the verb interpeller. In French, that verb is brusque and legal. It means to challenge, to question, to stop a person in the street, to take them into custody, to issue a summons. The second text is Ben Brewster's English translation, which says that ideology hails or interpellates individuals. Hail is Brewster's addition. There is no word for it in the French sentence. And in English, hailing is what you do to a taxi or to a passing ship, a respectful salutation. Warren Montag has counted what followed. Before 1970, the English verb interpellate barely existed outside parliamentary procedure. After Brewster, its use increased threefold, and the great majority of those uses point back to this one essay. A word with no settled meaning of its own was handed a meaning by its translator. Montag's charge is that Brewster simply elides the difficulties that attend the concept as well as the word itself. Montag says what is standing there is a summons, and behind the summons, he writes, is the force of law. It is also, he adds, a violent tearing them away from the crowd. So 50 years of debate about the magic of names has partly been a debate about a greeting. The scene on the page is a police stop, and the man is being pulled out of the crowd. Begin where Althusser begins, with a problem that has nothing to do with language. A society has to reproduce its arrangements every single morning, and almost none of that can be done by force. Police do not scale to the number of daily compliances a working economy requires. That was the pressure behind everything in the last hour. His answer was that ideology exists materially in the rituals and practices of institutions rather than in anybody's opinions. Now, the next step, which is the one this part is about. A practice is always somebody's. It is performed by a person in a place, and to be enrolled in it, you have to be addressed. The register is called. The form asks for a name, the rota assigns a slot, the priest turns to you and not to the person beside you. Address confers a place, a name, a role, a you. And here is the claim that does the work. Occupying that place and recognizing yourself in it is what being a subject consists of. There is no further thing underneath that then agrees to occupy it. So you recognize yourself, and the recognition gets one thing wrong. It feels like this: here I am, choosing to do this. That feeling is not where it started. It is what being addressed produced. So the practices come first, and the subject is what they produce. Althusser's demonstration is 30 seconds long. A voice behind you in the street calls out, "Hey, you there!" You turn. By that mere 180-degree physical conversion, he writes, the individual becomes a subject. Nothing has been proved and nothing has been threatened. The turn happened because you recognized that it really was you who was hailed and not someone else. The whole operation is complete before any thought about it begins. His preferred illustration is not advertising, which is what the theory tends to get used for now. It is Christianity. The voice calls a man by his name, and the answer is scripted in advance. It is really I, Moses, thy servant. When Moses asks the voice who it is, the voice answers that it is the one who is what it is. So the voice is a center that guarantees itself. Nothing outside it has to vouch for it. Everyone called by that voice is one of the small ones. Each of them sees himself in that center, and each recognizes the others because they are all reflected in the same place. Althusser calls this the duplicate mirror structure of ideology, and it closes on the word Amen, so be it. The religious case earns its place for a reason. The man being called has no doubt the call is for him, and feels no coercion whatsoever. Nobody is standing over him. In exchange for the obedience, he gets a stable identity and a world that makes sense. There are no subjects, Althusser writes, except by and for their subjection. The sentence people quote as pessimism is not a complaint at all. The individual is interpolated as a free subject precisely so that he shall freely accept his subjection. Subjects then work all right, he says, all by themselves. You are not free in spite of being subjected. The feeling of being free is the form the subjection takes. A subjection that feels like freedom needs no policeman. Then, on the same pages, he takes the scene back. The street was what he called a little theoretical theatre. It lays out in sequence something that happens in no sequence at all. In reality, individuals are always already subjects, even before they are born. The unborn child already has a name waiting, a father's surname, a room, a sex, a set of expectations. It is placed inside all of that before there is anyone there to install anything in. This is the piece Althusser took from psychoanalysis, and he took it deliberately. His party had spent a decade calling psychoanalysis a reactionary bourgeois ideology. In 1964, he published an essay in the party's own journal arguing that Freud had founded a science. The same year, he had helped move Lacan's seminar into the École Normale, after Lacan had been struck off the SFP's list of training analysts. What he wanted from Freud was a precedent. He needed a structure with laws, with real effects, and with nobody occupying the position of author. Ideology is eternal, he wrote, exactly like the unconscious. The objection that goes under Paul Hirst's name from a 1976 essay has never been fully answered. In the standard reconstruction, it is a single move. Turning round is not a reflex. It is a response to an address taken as addressed to me, and that means telling me from not me. That capacity is subjecthood. So whatever turned in that street was already a subject before the shout, and interpolation does not produce subjects. It presupposes them. The always already is the reply, and it works. There was never a pre-subject standing in the street, so there was never a genesis to be circular about. But the reply is expensive, and this is the honest part. If the man was already a subject, then, as Macquarie puts it, the call is not really responsible for the turning. The scene stops explaining how anyone becomes a subject and starts describing how someone stays one. And the thesis becomes very hard to disprove, since anything that happens to a subject can now be counted as interpolation. Except that Althusser left a crack in his own page, and it is a measurable one. He writes that the practical telecommunication of Heylings is such that they hardly ever miss their man. 9 times out of 10, he says, it is the right one. Hear that as arithmetic. It is a statistical claim, sitting inside a thesis on which a miss should be impossible. The move about to be made deserves naming, because a later part will put exactly this kind of reading on trial. Treating a man's figure of speech as arithmetic is a liberty. It is worth taking anyway, because the crack it exposes is real, whatever the number turns out to be. So take his number to a laboratory. Your own name is spoken in a channel you are not attending to. The measured detection rate is roughly 1 in 3, not 9 in 10. And Conway's group showed in 2001 who that third are. They are people with relatively low working memory capacity, the ones least able to block out distraction. On that result, the man who turns in the street is not the man who recognized himself. He is the man who could not keep the noise out. As Montag reports James Martell's argument, Martell takes the crack and makes it the centre of the theory. Every act of interpolation is also an act of misinterpolation, always catching the wrong people too. And there is a scene the theory cannot absorb. Fanon is walking in daylight when a child catches sight of him and calls out his race to its mother. No voice from behind, no anonymity, no summons backed by law. A child, face to face, in the open. He turns, and what he is handed is not the place of a free and responsible author of his acts. He is fixed, described, made an object among the objects on the street. The call works perfectly and confers nothing, which means nobody is ever interpolated as a subject in general. One is interpolated as a particular kind, and the kind is not chosen by the person turning. Judith Butler is usually credited with pressing the remaining gap as a question, and it is still open. Althusser tells us that the man turns, and he never once tells us why the man turns. Notice what the always already has done to your position. If you were already answering the call before you can remember answering anything, then the call is being issued somewhere. Not by someone. Somewhere. Which room? Part 4. The building you spent 12 years inside. In March and April of 1969, a man sat in an apartment inside a school on the Rue d'Ulm. He wrote about 150 pages on how a society reproduces the people it needs. 10 months earlier, 9 million French workers had stopped working in a revolt that started inside the universities. He then cut roughly 30 pages out of that manuscript and sent them to a journal, which printed them in June 1970. Those 30 pages became one of the most assigned texts in the humanities. The rest sat in a box until 1995 in French and 2014 in English. So almost everything anyone has argued about this theory was argued against the extract. Start where he starts, with a sentence he takes from Marx. A social formation that did not reproduce the conditions of production while it was producing would not last a year. Machines wear out and get replaced, and the economy handles that itself. Labour power is the hard case. It is reproduced outside the firm, in wages, in households, and in the years before anyone is hired. Here is the premise the whole essay turns on. Reproducing labour power requires not only a reproduction of its skills, but a reproduction of its submission to the ruling ideology. That premise is carrying weight, so make it explicit. A competent worker is not automatically an obedient one. Skill in welding says nothing about whether you accept the wage, the shift, the foreman, or the deadline. The factory cannot install the difference, because the worker walks through the door already formed. nor can the police install it. A state that ruled by force alone would need one officer per citizen, permanently, forever. So something forms people before employment begins, and it has to work without being experienced as force. His answer splits the state in two. On one side, the repressive apparatus, government, administration, army, police, courts, prisons. It is one thing, it is public, and it works massively by force and only secondarily by ideology. On the other side, the ideological apparatuses, which are plural and mostly counted as private. They run the other way round, massively by ideology and secondarily by punishment. A school expels, a church excommunicates, and a family punishes. Now, the list itself, which is almost always quoted with its end cut off. The religious apparatus, meaning the system of the different churches, the educational apparatus, the system of public and private schools, the family, the legal apparatus, the political apparatus, which he specifies as the political system including the different parties, the trade union apparatus, the communications apparatus, press, radio and television, and the cultural apparatus, literature, the arts, sports. Read that list again with the author standing inside it. A member of the French Communist Party has just classified the unions and the parties as ideological apparatuses of the bourgeois state. That was the party he stayed inside for his entire adult life. The obvious objection arrives at once, and he answers it inside the essay. Your family is not the state. A newspaper is privately owned, and no minister tells it what to print. His reply is that the distinction between public and private is a distinction internal to bourgeois law. The law that sorts institutions into public and private is installed by the state. So it cannot be the test of what belongs to the state. It is unimportant whether the institutions are public or private. What matters is how an institution functions, and not who holds the title deeds. Then the historical claim, which is an empirical one and could be wrong. In mature capitalist societies, the school has taken the dominant position, and the school and family couple has replaced the church and family couple. Religion did not stop mattering to anybody. The claim is about reach. The school is the only apparatus that takes every child of every class. It takes them for the most hours a week, over the most years, at the most formable age. It does all that while everyone agrees it is neutral. Its ideological effect is protected by the general belief that it has none. So take two 15-year-olds in the same building, same corridor, same bell, same raised hands. Somewhere around the age of 16, Althusser writes, a huge mass of children are ejected into production. One of these two leaves with a certificate of basic skills and goes to work. The other carries on and will be trained to give orders, to handle workers, and to speak well. In part 1, that raised hand was innocuous, because nothing written on the board was a lie. It is the same hand here, and here it is an instrument of sorting. Neither child experiences a sorting. Each experiences a fact about themselves. In 2023, Raj Chetty and 2 colleagues matched federal tax records against college admissions records. Hold the test score constant. Compare a child from a top 1% family with a middle-class child who scored the same. The rich child is more than twice as likely to attend an Ivy Plus college. 2/3 of that gap sits inside the admissions decision itself. 3 administrative practices carry it: a legacy box, a ratings rubric that rewards expensive private schools, and a place on a sports roster. The apparatus never has to lie about the outcome. It only needs the outcome to look like a verdict on a person. Part 2 left you an empty author's chair, and there the emptiness was close to relief. Nobody wrote the script, so there is nobody to blame and nobody to defeat. Here the same emptiness turns cold. The sorting is real, it happens to an entire cohort every year, and it goes out under nobody's signature. That is exactly why it reads as a verdict on persons. An unsigned outcome offers the child nowhere else to look. Now the objection, and it is the hardest one in this video. Everything so far has explained an institution by what it does for the system. But a need is not a cause. Saying the system needs obedient workers does not by itself explain why this school is here. Something has to select the institutions that do the job and discard the ones that do not, and a theory has to name it. Marxism has a standard candidate for that mechanism, and it is class struggle. Class struggle is precisely what the 30-page extract left out. And the machine described in the extract never breaks. Individuals are hailed, they turn round, and in his phrase, they work all by themselves. A theory built that way cannot explain school strikes, or dropping out, or a teacher who radicalizes a class. Least of all can it explain what had just happened outside the window. The largest general strike in French history had detonated out of the dominant ideological apparatus. 10 months later, he sat down to explain how that apparatus produces submission. There is a second problem, and it concerns the word state. If family, church, unions, parties, press and culture are all state apparatuses, the word has stopped distinguishing anything. A truncheon and a school assembly end up in the same category. The sharpest test came in 1977 from Paul Willis. He studied a group of working-class boys who rejected everything their school valued. They were not passive recipients of an ideology, and they were not fooled about the place for a second. The rejection delivered them, on time, into manual labour. Reproduction was achieved through opposition. The outcome, the theory predicts, arrived by a route the theory has no vocabulary for. The defence is genuine, and it should be given its best hearing. In a note he appended to the manuscript in 1976, Althusser insisted that the class struggle never ends inside these institutions. On the reading his defenders take from that note, the apparatuses are not instruments owned by a class. They are the ground the fight happens on, and they are also what the fight is about. Whoever controls a school is not using a settled instrument. They are holding something the other side is trying to take. The manuscript supports him. The book that the extract was cut from carries chapters on law, on the state, and on revolution. Since the full text reached English readers in the 2010s, the dispute has moved onto textual ground. The flat claim that there is no class struggle in this theory is now false about the text. The counter-reply still stands. A correction that lives in an appendix is not a repair of the argument structure. A rival account arrived in the same year as the article. Bourdieu and Passeron published Reproduction in 1970, with a different mechanism entirely. Their school does not form subjects by summoning them. It rewards a cultural inheritance it never distributed, and then certifies the result as ability. Their name for that is symbolic violence. What the school produces on their account is legitimation. inequality that has been made to look like talent. If you have ever met the phrase cultural capital, that is where it comes from. Empirical education research ran with them rather than with Althusser, for a plain reason. They counted survival rates by class, examination results, who leaves and when. Althusser argued conceptually and produced no cohort at all. One last fact, and it is not scored against him. The man who named the school as the dominant apparatus lived inside one. He became a student at the École Normale Supérieure in 1945 and worked there until November 1980, 35 years. He was housed, fed and employed by the dominant apparatus for his whole working life. In the memoir he calls it a true maternal cocoon, the place where he was in the warm and at home. That is his own thesis holding, not failing. The apparatus is lived as obviousness, including by the person who can take it apart. Which leaves the question this part cannot answer. If the school worked on you and the family, and later a union or a party, then each of them worked on something. None of them received an empty child. The school took delivery of someone the family had already been forming for 5 years, and the family took delivery of someone too. So the version of you all these apparatuses were shaping had to exist before any of them got there. Something got there first. Part 5. The version of you that came first. A young philosophy student in Paris opens a book that has only just come back into circulation. It is Marx, but not the Marx his party has been handing him. It is about alienation, about labour that turns against the person doing it, about an essence of man that industrial society separates him from. He is reading it in the year his political tradition fell apart under him. The text seems to describe his own condition line by line. What had fallen apart was this. In February 1956, at the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, Khrushchev delivers a speech to a closed session. Within months, its contents are everywhere. Since 1947, the Soviet model had reached French communists through party schools and party literature. That was the pipe through which most of them had received Marxism at all. The speech did not only condemn a dead premier, it broke the line the whole thing had been arriving through, and left the people at the far end of it holding nothing. Althusser's account of what his own country had to fall back on is unsparing. He names the stubborn, profound absence of any real theoretical culture in the history of the French workers' movement. Germany had produced Marx and Engels. Russia had Lenin and Plekhanov. Italy had Gramsci. France had a large communist party and a militant working class. What it had never produced was philosophical masters of its own, because the bourgeoisie had absorbed its intellectuals after the revolution. Then Stalinism reduced what philosophy remained to commentary and silence. So a generation arrived at 1956, holding a politics with no philosophy underneath it. Into that opening came the book. Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 had been long out of circulation and were now going round as a rediscovery. Young philosophers who had just watched their political tradition collapse opened that text and found their own condition described. Althusser wrote later, in the first-person plural, about how eager and happy they had been. They rediscovered their own burning passions, he said, in the ideological flame of Marx's early works. The people in that sentence include him, and the room he is describing is the one he was standing in. You have had that experience from inside, whatever the book was. A book or an essay or one paragraph of a stranger's writing that seemed to be about you specifically. What arrives with it is stronger than agreement. It is recognition, and recognition issues its own certificate. This is true because it is me. That certificate is the whole problem, and a generation of very careful readers accepted it without examining the paper it was printed on. The humanist answer deserves its strongest version, because it was a serious answer held by serious people. The camps happened, the show trials happened. A movement that had promised liberation had produced a police state, and the question was how a socialist could face that. The humanist reply was to go back to the young Marx and put real men and women at the centre again. Stalinism was a crime against the human person, and the cure was to restore the human person to the theory. Roger Garaudy, the French party's official philosopher, made that case, and Sartre made a version of it from outside the party. The official Soviet answer ran alongside it, and was even simpler. The disaster was the cult of personality, one man's excess of power, a flaw of character at the top of a state. That explanation is worth taking apart. The word doing the work is personality, a character, a proper name, one man's vanity swollen past all limit. Historical materialism has no concept of personality that could explain a state form. So the official self-criticism of Stalinism was conducted in a vocabulary the theory does not contain. The result is a formula that is emotionally impeccable and politically useless. It condemns everything and explains nothing. It leaves the structure that produced the camps unexamined, and it leaves the slot open for whoever occupies it next. That pressure is what produces theoretical anti-humanism, and the adjective is carrying the whole load. The claim is not that people do not matter, do not suffer, or do not act. The claim is about where an explanation may start. Here is the argument. Any theory that founds history on an essence of man must say two things at once. The essence has to be universal, the same in everyone, or it explains nothing general, and it has to be fully present in each individual, or it explains nothing particular. So you get a picture of the essence taken from philosophy and a picture of the individual taken from experience, welded together. The two halves come from opposite places. The essence is supplied by philosophy, and then the experience brought in to confirm it has already been described in the essence's own terms. Each half guarantees the other, and neither is ever tested. What Althusser puts in its place is not a better essence. It is a set of relations, inside which individuals are supports, and inside which their picture of themselves is one of the things being produced. Which is why he insists that what happened to Marx in 1845 was not a change of opinions. He calls it a change of problematic. Answers can be revised for years, while the field of questions stays exactly where it was. And it cannot be inspected directly because it is largely unconscious to the thinker working inside it. The strongest reply to all of this came from a historian who spent his life in archives. In 1978, E.P. Thompson published The Poverty of Theory, subtitled An Orrery of Errors. An orrery is a clockwork model of the heavens. It runs beautifully, and it is not the heavens. His charge is structural. If evidence is always already constituted inside a theory, then a historian's encounter with the archive can never convict that theory of anything. Every refutation gets redescribed as an ideological symptom. The system moves inside the circle of its own procedures and mistakes the intensity of that motion for a science. The break thesis is where the blade goes in cleanest, and you can test it yourself on any page of Marx. A mature-sounding passage written before 1845 is the old problematic still speaking. A humanist-sounding passage written after it is a survival. Marx's own testimony cannot count because the problematic is defined as unconscious to him. Nothing at all is admitted as evidence against the reading, which is what Thompson means when he calls the edifice theology. And he does not stop at theology. He writes that Althusserianism is Stalinism reduced to the paradigm of theory. The reason is that a doctrine whose custodians alone decide what counts as evidence already has the shape of the thing it claims to diagnose. The honest thing to report is that Althusser gave ground, and how much. In 1967 he gave up his own criterion. In 1978 he went further. Materialist and idealist concepts, he said, are hopelessly intermixed throughout Marx. Marx never fully abandoned Hegel's logic, or the concept of alienation, or the idea that history has a goal. A thesis that survives by giving up its own criterion has stopped being a finding. It is a research program. There is one more fact, and it belongs on the table with the rest. It is not a point scored, and it refutes nothing, since a thesis about how to explain history was never a rule for how to live. Between 1961 and 1973, Althusser wrote letters to an Italian translator named Franca Madonia. Those are the exact years of On the Young Marx, of For Marx, of Reading Capital, and of the reply to John Lewis. That last one insists it is the masses who make history and not man. The letters were published in 1998 and run to roughly 800 pages. Across the same 12 years in which he removed the human subject from history's explanation, he wrote 800 pages of first person to one woman. The theory has nowhere to put them, and he never claimed it did. Warren Montag, who worked through the manuscripts and the marginalia, argues that Althusser was never a structuralist at all. On that reading, most existing critiques hit a position he did not hold. Grant it, and the hardest consequence survives anyway. Remember what the relations were said to produce. Not only what you do, but the account you give of yourself. So, if man cannot be the starting point of an explanation, there is no earlier, uninstalled version of you underneath the installed one. There is nobody in there to consult. There is no original opinion to compare the current one against. Which means the audit has no instrument and no baseline. You cannot check yourself by asking yourself. So the question becomes, what else can be read, and how? Part 6. What your own reasons are hiding. What would it look like from the inside to be unable to think something? Not the experience of being wrong or of overlooking a fact, but of being built so the question cannot come up at all. The honest answer is that it looks like nothing. There is no blank where the missing question would sit, no snag in the reasoning, no edge you can feel yourself pressed against. That is why the audit keeps coming back clean. Althusser went at this through reading, so start where he started. A book lies open on a table. The words are in order, in daylight, available to anyone with eyes. Whatever the book means, it means it on the page, and reading is the act of lifting it off. He called this the religious myth of reading. A voice speaks, the world is a great book, and the truth is present in every word to whoever can see. Reading on that picture is immediate, and a failure to read is only a lapse of attention. Underneath it sits a picture of knowledge in general, and it is the one most of us actually use. The essence of a thing is a real part of the thing, sitting inside it like a nut inside a shell. Knowing is cracking the shell. You strip away what is inessential, and you are left holding what was there all along. Now follow what that commits you to. If the essence is genuinely a part of the object, then the knowledge is finished before anybody knows anything. It is lying there in the object, waiting to be collected. The thing and the knowledge of the thing collapse into each other, and nothing is left for a scientist to do except look harder. Althusser's counterclaim is that knowledge is not collected, but manufactured. A science never begins from a pure and absolute fact. It begins from material somebody has already worked. Available notions, prior results, borrowed concepts, most of them ideological when it picks them up. It transforms that material using tools its own theory supplies, and the product is a concept that was not in the raw material. Raw material, means of production, product. The analogy is deliberately industrial, and the point of it is negative. There is no moment in any science at which thought touches an unprocessed given. In his own phrase, it all takes place within knowledge, which gives every theory a perimeter. Althusser's word for it is the problematic, the field of questions a body of thought is able to pose. A problematic does not merely permit certain answers. It manufactures a matching blindness, and this is the part that matters. The same connection that defines what is visible defines the invisible as its shadowy obverse. The blindness is the shape of the seeing, viewed from its other side. So it cannot be corrected by attention, because attention is the thing that has the shape. That gives the method its signature, and the signature is testable. You are not hunting for hidden depths or for what an author secretly meant. You are looking for an answer with no question attached to it. Where an answer floats free of anything the text could have asked, the text is answering a question its own framework forbids it to formulate. Here is the case Althusser ran it on. Classical political economy asks what the value of labour is, and Smith answers that it equals the value of the goods needed to reproduce labour. That answer is correct. Any ordinary reader gives Smith and Ricardo a good mark and moves on. Read the sentence strictly, though, and a term has changed inside it. Subsistence goods do not reproduce labour. They reproduce the labourer, the living person who carries the capacity. So the answer answers a question nobody in the room asked. What is the value of labour power? They could not ask it. In a vocabulary where the wage is simply the price of work done, labour power as a commodity distinct from labour is not a false concept. It is a concept that does not exist. Watch what happens once it does. The worker sells the capacity to work for a day. The wage covers what it costs to keep him alive for that day. The day is longer than that. The difference had no name until labour power had one, and its name is surplus value. That is the whole of Marx's economics, arriving through a gap in somebody else's sentence. Non-vision is inside vision. What classical political economy does not see is not what it fails to look at. It is what it sees. Take that back to 2 a.m. You have been searching your convictions for foreign objects, and the search is competent and it finds nothing, and you conclude the convictions are yours. On this account, the search was always going to find nothing, because a question your framework cannot pose does not arrive as an absence. It arrives as the smooth, uninterrupted feeling of having thought the matter through. The method needs a way of telling a scientific concept from an ideological one, but any such test is itself a theoretical product, made inside some problematic by the same industrial process as everything else. So the criterion cannot stand outside the thing it is judging. Althusser accepted the circle and denied that it was vicious, and many readers have found that answer to be the question restated in a calmer voice. He did not hold the line either. By 1967, he conceded that there was no criterion sufficient to demarcate scientific from ideological concepts, and that all theoretical concepts are marked by ideology. The deeper trouble is that his own theory of ideology eats the exemption. By his own account, the theorist writing about problematics is a constituted subject. He works inside a field of sayable questions he did not choose and cannot inventory from within. If that is true, the symptomatic reader has no flaw. Smith could not step outside his own vocabulary to check it. Neither can the man checking Smith. He paid for that in public on his own book. In March 1969, he wrote a preface for a mass-market paperback of the first volume of Capital. It was written for worker readers. The man who taught a generation to read Capital slowly tells them to skip the beginning. Put the whole of Part 1 aside, he writes, and begin your reading with Part 2. He is explicit that this is not a suggestion. It is a recommendation he is prepared to present as an imperative. What he quarantines is Chapter 1, and inside it the section on commodity fetishism. That is the passage cultural theory has treated as its crown jewel for 50 years, the doorway through which reification and alienation walk into Marx. Althusser's reason is that Hegel is loudest exactly there. So the man who built the instrument turned it on the book his whole career stood on, and found contamination page by page. He had taken the idea of the rupture from Bachelard, for whom a science breaks with its own past again and again. By 1969 he was running one of those breaks through Marx himself. Which tells you what the instrument does and who it can be pointed at. Aimed at a book, it always finds something, because a book has an edge and you can stand outside it. Aimed at the person holding it, it comes back clean every time, because there is nowhere outside your own framework to stand while you check. But the whole apparatus grants something to the person operating it. A reader who can specify what a writer was structurally unable to think has claimed a place above that writer. That claim is simply the method working normally. Somebody handed him that place. The question is who and what a person is actually doing when he accepts it. Part 7. The trap in being the one who explains. Somewhere in the last hour you had a specific pleasure, and it is worth naming because it is what this part is about. It is the feeling of being told how the machinery works while other people are still inside it. It did not wait for you to check anything. It arrived early, warm, and slightly above the material, and it has a shape. The shape is a raised hand in a classroom, except that you have moved to the front of the room. In 1974, a former student of Althusser's published a book about him. Jacques Rancière had written one of the chapters of Reading Capital, so the book is a renunciation by a co-author. Its charge is not that the theory is false. Its charge is that the theory produces exactly the pleasure just described, and that the pleasure is the domination the theory claims to expose. That argument is the strongest thing anyone has said against this whole project, and it has to be built properly before it can be answered. Start from the premises, because each one is Althusser's. First, ideology is lived rather than believed. It keeps working even when you have thought it over and can defend it. It is the medium in which people have a world at all. Second, if that is what it is, then people inside it cannot see out of it by their own means. The seeing apparatus is part of what was installed. Third, knowledge of their condition must therefore arrive from somewhere else, from whoever holds the science. And fourth, that arrangement already has a name. It is the pedagogic relation, one who knows and ones who do not, with the instruction confirming the gap rather than closing it. Rancière's conclusion follows without a further step, and his reviewer, Ashley Borer, states the thesis this way. Fundamentally, Althusserianism is a theory of education, and every theory of education is committed to preserving the power it brings to light. Then the exhibit, which is what turns that from a mood into a case. In the mid-60s, Althusser wrote a piece called Student Problems, and the radical philosophy translation of it is unambiguous. The pedagogic situation in that rendering rests on what he calls the absolute condition of an inequality between a knowledge and a lack of knowledge. From there he argues against students having a say in what they are taught. He argues against self-instruction too. A collective rediscovering knowledge on its own produces only half-knowledge, he says, and people holding half-knowledge are easy to manipulate. 4 years before the barricades, the philosopher of the school apparatus was defending the seating plan. The exact shape of the accusation matters here because it is easy to soften into something smaller. The charge is not that a philosopher held stuffy opinions about universities. It is that one single structure shows up in 3 places at once. In the theory of knowledge, science stands over ideology. In the lecture hall, the master stands over the student. In the party, the leadership stands over the members. Rancière's claim is that the party version is the truth of the other two. The theory of knowledge was the license. Party discipline was what it produced. He also indicts himself, which is what makes it hard to wave away. As his reviewer, Nathan Brown, reports the admission, the rigour of the theory convinced some of them to join the battle inside the Communist Student Union. They went in to restore Marxist rigour. Bruno Bostiels, reviewing the book in 2011, grants the core of the charge. The science and ideology distinction, in Rancière's words, functioned to justify the eminent dignity of the possessors of knowledge. If you have ever explained someone to themselves, you know the dignity he means. Now, the best available answer, which the standard accounts of the quarrel do not press, and which comes from Althusser's own pen in the same years. In March 1969, he wrote the preface to that same cheap paperback Capital, the one that issues the reading orders. About the exploitation workers live, he says roughly this. Proletarians will understand it because it is the scientific theory of something they experience every day. About educated readers, he is far harsher. For them, he says, an education of their consciousness is not enough, and neither is a reading of the book. They need something more like a rupture in their consciousness, a move from bourgeois class instinct to proletarian class positions. So the schoolmaster is on record saying that the workers read the book better, that being exploited is a cognitive advantage and being educated a handicap. There are institutional facts pulling the same way, and they are odd enough to be worth having. The man defending pedagogic inequality in 1964 was not a professor. He was an exam coach with no doctorate and no chair. The standard accusation is that he trimmed his anti-humanism to fit what the party wanted. Nathan Brown corrects the dates. The Critique of Humanism was written in 1964, before the party had any use for it, so the accusation needs him to have known in advance. And the English one-voice Althusser is partly an artifact of an edition. The English text everyone argued with was translated from an abridged French edition, with Rancière's chapter among those dropped. None of that acquits him, and it is important not to pretend otherwise. Read the preface again for who is speaking. It is the philosopher who certifies that the worker's reading is the correct one. It is his sentence in his book awarding the advantage. A worker who disagreed with the award would be corrected by the same authority that granted it. The verdict has been reversed and the bench has not moved. Which is where this stops being about 1964. In Part 1, the raised hand was a child's, asking permission to speak, and it was innocent. That was the whole point of it. Here it is the same hand at the other end of the room, and it belongs to whoever is doing the explaining. A theory that explains to people how their convictions were installed reproduces in its own form the inequality it was built to expose. That includes this. For an hour, a voice has been telling you what you're standing inside, and the hand at the front of the room is mine. Saying it out loud is not a defense, and the honest position is that the charge stands and the video continues anyway. Two things are worth adding, neither of them a rescue. Bostiles notices that the engine of Rancière's later politics is still an Althusserian one, the gap he called décalage. On that account, politics begins when people stop being what their place says they are. But that needs an account of how a place gets to feel natural in the first place, and the only account on offer is the apparatus. And in 1993, Rancière went back and reread Althusser's writing as literature rather than as instruction. That is a softening by the prosecutor, not an acquittal by the court. So take the refusal all the way. Rancière's later position is that equal intelligence is not a result you demonstrate. It is a starting assumption, and you either work from it or you do not. Suppose you decline the whole arrangement, explainer and explained, and keep only that. You still get up tomorrow inside the same building, on the same schedule, doing the same things at the same hours. Which raises the question this part cannot answer. Does knowing any of this reach a single thing about how you will actually live? Part 8. Why seeing through it changes nothing? A clipboard, a paper survey, a pen? The questions are ordinary ones. Some ask about moral principles in the abstract. Some ask about arguments running in the news that month. Each has a scale for how strongly you agree. What the person holding the pen cannot see is the back of the clipboard. It is rigged with a conjuring trick. When the sheet is turned over, the answers just given can be lifted away and replaced with their opposites. The person turning the page sees nothing. Then the survey is handed back, and they are asked to talk through what they wrote. This was run in 2012 by Lars Hall and his colleagues, and the sensible expectation is easy to state. You would catch it. Maybe not on the mild items, the ones you shaded in without much feeling, but certainly on the 2 or 3 that matter. A person knows what they think about torture, or about surveillance, or about whatever the country was arguing over that week. Handed back a sheet claiming they think the reverse, they would frown and say somebody had mixed up the forms. 69% failed to catch at least one of the 2 reversals, and then argued fluently for the opposite. The reasons arrived on time. They always do. Be careful about what that license is. It does not show that people have no opinions. It shows where the reasons come from, and they come afterwards on request, in whatever quantity the situation asks for. The person defending the reversed answer is not lying, and is not confused in any way they could detect. They are doing the thing you do when you audit yourself, and doing it well. The material they are doing it on was handed to them 4 minutes ago by a folded piece of paper. Althusser's account of why that happens is not a claim about attention. It rests on a proposition about what kind of object ideology is, and he states it in a form built to sound wrong. Ideology has no history, not in the sense Marx meant, where ideology is a dream and a nothing, and therefore has no history worth writing. Althusser means it in what he calls a positive sense, omnipresent, trans-historical, and therefore immutable in form throughout the extent of history. His word for that is eternal, and he says it is eternal exactly like the unconscious. That sentence is easy to misread, so hold the distinction still for a moment. Particular ideologies have furious histories. Christian ideology, legal ideology, the humanism this video spent a whole part on. All of them arise and mutate and die, and their history is the history of class struggle. What has no history is the mechanism, the furnishing of a lived relation to conditions you did not choose. So it is theorized the way one theorizes a mechanism, not the way one narrates a period. The unconscious is the model because Freud claimed something structurally similar. Condensation and displacement do not improve over the centuries, and there is no progress inside the unconscious, only the same operations wherever you look. And the clinic supplies the consequence the viewer came for. A patient can be given an interpretation, accept it, and restate it more elegantly than the analyst who offered it, and remain exactly as they were. Freud needed resistance and working through as concepts precisely because understanding turned out not to be treatment. If the unconscious were a set of hidden sentences, telling the patient would end the matter. So the reason critique rarely converts anybody is not that the arguments are weak. It is that they are arguments. What you see through is a proposition, and what holds you is a relation you live, and those are not the same kind of thing. Hold that against the street, where a voice calls out behind you. The one who turns round, furious, ready to take the caller apart, has turned round. Then comes the part almost nobody expects from a communist. On this account, ideology does not end with class society either. In his own phrase, human societies secrete ideology as the very element and atmosphere indispensable to their historical respiration and life. He says plainly that historical materialism cannot conceive of even a communist society doing without it, which removes a target. Critique cannot aim at abolishing ideology, because there is no arrangement of people in which the lived relation goes away. What politics can aim at is the transformation of apparatuses, and nothing else was ever on offer. Now the attacks, because that position has two bad joints, and one of them is in this video's own evidence. The first is the analogy. Freud's unconscious sits inside one person, in equipment every human being is born with. That is why it does not change over the centuries. And it comes with a procedure, a room, an hour, years of work on one patient. Ideology sits in schools, courts and parties which are built differently in every century, and there is no couch for a society. The thing that made the psychoanalytic case respectable was having a way to work on the object. That is exactly the part that does not transfer. Althusser writes that the two eternities are, in his words, not unrelated, and then never says how. That is a simile doing the work of a warrant. The second is worse. A theory on which no insight ever moves anything cannot be contradicted by anything. People change their minds, ideologies collapse, and both events get reabsorbed as changes of content inside an unchanged form. A theory that survives every outcome has stopped predicting and started decorating, and what it licenses in practice is sitting still. It also eats its author. He wrote that there is no practice except by and in an ideology, and theory is a practice. So the sentence you were just persuaded by came out of the mechanism it describes. Now turn that on this video's own evidence, because the honesty is the argument. Part 1 leaned on amnesic patients whose attitude shifted after a choice they could not remember making. That study used the free choice paradigm, and in 2010 Keith Chen and Jane Risen proved a theorem about it. They showed the method can produce that reading even when nobody's preference has moved. A person picks one of two options they rated the same, and the procedure scores that pick as a change of mind. And the assumptions the theorem needs are the ordinary ones, present in the standard version of the experiment. 50 years of findings, and the measuring ritual may have been generating the belief it claimed to observe. The belief did not live in the head being measured. It lived in the procedure that measured it. That is, ideology's material existence, arriving inside the laboratory built to test it. State the rescue as honestly as the damage. In 2014, Coppin and colleagues added the control sequence the critique demands. A real effect survived for the options people rejected, though not for the ones they chose. Something is there, and it is narrower than the textbook sold. The same discipline offers a second warning. In 2012, Doyen and colleagues rebuilt the famous demonstration that stereotype cues silently slow how people walk, and under automated timing it failed to replicate. It reappeared only in the runs where the experimenters expected it. The effect was real. It was in the people holding the stopwatch. Whether any of this amounts to fatalism is the live quarrel. The Spinozist line of reading, associated above all with Warren Montag, takes the immutable form as immanence rather than doom. The current growth area, the work on misinterpolation and overinterpolation, builds theories of the mechanism's misfires out of Althusser's own machinery. That work exists because his version has no account of failure, and a mechanism that cannot fail cannot be resisted either. But grant the position its strength, and something follows that none of its critics dispute. If your own insight is inert, then whatever leverage exists is not yours alone and never was. It sits in something you would have to join. That is the one move everybody watching has already made, at least once, and usually with results they would rather not discuss. Part 9. Why the groups you join turn into the thing you left. On the 24th of April 1978, and for 3 days after, the Paris Daily Le Monde ran 4 articles by a communist about his own party. Le Monde was a paper outside the party's control. He was writing there because the party press was closed to the party's members. A month earlier, the Union of the Left had broken apart, and the Left had lost the legislative elections. The Political Bureau had already published its finding. The Communist Party bears no responsibility for this situation, it said, and the guiding line has remained consistent during the last 6 years. Then it invited the membership to discuss what had gone wrong. And the General Secretary, Georges Marchais, was pressed on why members could not argue in their own press. He justified the closure by citing a clause in the statutes that does not exist. The obvious reading of that is cowardice. Frightened men at the top of a losing organization, protecting their positions, inventing a rule because inventing one was easier than answering. That reading is available, and it is probably true, and Althusser thought it explained nothing. The same shape had grown in the Russian party decades earlier, where the organization had ended up merged with the state. A defect that reliable is not a defect of character. His claim was that the leadership was filling a hole, and that the hole was in the theory. To see the hole, you have to see what he had already taken back. In 1965, he published 2 books, For Marx and Reading Capital. In them, he defined philosophy as the theory of theoretical practice. Philosophy supplies the general account of how sciences produce knowledge, and it separates scientific concepts from ideological ones. Consider what that makes philosophy: a tribunal, the court that certifies which concepts count as knowledge, sitting outside the sciences and guaranteeing them. And in the same 2 books he had attacked exactly that arrangement as idealism, because nothing stands outside the sciences with the authority to underwrite them. The definition contradicted the critique. One of them had to go, and he kept the critique. What is left is thin, deliberately. Philosophy has no object, and it produces no knowledge. In a Sorbonne lecture in 1968, he put it flatly. If philosophy has no object, nothing can happen in it. What philosophy does instead is state theses and draw a dividing line between ideas declared true and ideas declared false. But a line drawn by no knowledge is still authorized by something. His answer is that it is authorized by a position taken in a conflict. Philosophy, he wrote, represents politics in the domain of theory and represents scientificity in politics. 2 directions, not one. Inside theory, philosophy is where a political position gets stated as a thesis. Inside politics, it is where the demand to be scientific gets stated as a claim. In June 1975, he stood in front of a jury at the University of Amiens. He was 56, and he had never held a doctorate. He had never held a chair, either. He was an exam tutor at the École Normale, coaching candidates for the examination he had passed himself in 1948. 27 years of the same corridor and the same syllabus. Every autumn, a new set of young faces arrived, to be coached toward the gate he had once walked through. He never left it. 10 years earlier, his 2 books had made him the most institutionally influential Marxist philosopher in Europe. Now he was being examined for the highest degree of French university awards. The work under examination was the work of a man whose stated position was that philosophy produces no knowledge. The institution asked him to demonstrate a result. He could only take a position. 2 years later, in Venice, at a conference titled Power and Opposition in Post-Revolutionary Societies, he opened with a sentence that reads like relief. At last, the crisis of Marxism has exploded. At last, it is in full view. The crisis was not new on his account. It had been hatching for decades, and Stalinism had blocked it rather than settled it. What was collapsing was not the theory, but a claim made on its behalf, the claim that it was complete. Marxism is finite, he wrote the following March, limited to the analysis of the capitalist mode of production and the opposite of a philosophy of history. Then he listed what was missing, and the list is short and very specific. There is no Marxist theory of the state. What the tradition supplies is warnings against bourgeois conceptions of the state, and a warning is a demarcation rather than a concept. It supplies a metaphor, the state as a machine, an instrument in the hands of a class, which says nothing about how the instrument runs, and it supplies Lenin, lecturing in July 1919, saying that the state is a special thing without saying in what its specificity consists. That last one restates the problem in a confident voice. The second gap is the one that reaches you. You will not find in the Marxist heritage, he wrote, any real theory of the organizations of class struggle. No theory of the party, no theory of the union, nothing on what happens when an organization built to fight an apparatus starts to fuse with one. A movement that had produced a century of analysis of factories and commodities had produced almost nothing about the committee. Here is the premise that makes that fatal rather than merely embarrassing. An organization with no theory of organization does not stay shapeless while it waits for one. It has to meet on Tuesdays, decide who speaks, decide who reports to whom. So it takes the nearest available form, and the nearest available form is the form of the thing it is fighting. In the party Althusser was writing about, that form was a 3-tier chain of delegation. Cell to branch, branch to region, region to central committee, with the effect that no cell could compare its own analysis with any other cells. Nobody designed that to imitate a ministry. Communists could not argue inside their own press, so they argued in a bourgeois newspaper. The closure was defended by citing a rule that did not exist. An organization with no theory of organization grows the shape of the thing it opposes. His conclusion followed straight from that. The number one trap, he wrote, is the state. So the party must stand outside it, under the bourgeois state, and even more so under a proletarian one. Etienne Balibar answered him that same year, and the answer is close to fatal. The masses are not, in any case, outside the state. They are always already caught up in a network of state relations. And the theory that establishes this is Althusser's own. His 1970 list of ideological state apparatuses names the political system, including the different parties, and names the trade unions. He had put the party on the list himself 8 years before, demanding that it stand off the list. So an outside is a wish, and the real question is the contradictory place the party occupies inside. The student took the teacher's instrument and cut off the teacher's conclusion with it. Of everything in this video, that is the cleanest case of a theory outliving its author's use of it. Rancière had already run a second blade through the retraction 4 years earlier. If philosophy is class struggle in theory, then the front line runs through seminar rooms. As Todd May quotes him, there was no need to take philosophy out of the lecture halls, for class struggle was in those halls. A man who relocates the struggle to the room he is already standing in has conceded nothing. He gave up the tribunal and kept the building. The two live objections pull in opposite directions. On Sotiris's reading, Nikos Poulantzas cuts against the claim that a theory of the state was missing at all. What looks like a machine is the current score between the classes, written into offices and rules. Christine Bucci-Glucksmann, writing in May 1978, went the other way and agreed there were holes. Her charge was that the inventory was incomplete. It said nothing about the liberation of women, nothing about dispersed micro-powers. He had catalogued the gaps his party's collapse made visible and missed the ones 1968 had made visible. Which is where this lands on whatever organisation currently has your Tuesday evenings. The test is not whether its stated principles differ from the ones it was founded against, because they will. The test is procedural and boring, and you can run it this week. Ask who sets the agenda and whether anyone can put an item on it without permission. Ask whether two people doing the same work in different places can compare notes directly, or only upward through someone whose job is to summarize them. Ask what happens to a disagreement once it is written down. An organization that cannot answer those questions has already taken a form, and it did not choose it. He said the party must stand outside the state. Balibar said that nobody is outside. And in November 1980, the state removed the man who wrote all of this from the category of people who can answer for anything. Part 10. The Case That Was Never Heard. Article 64 of the French Penal Code of 1810 stayed in force for 184 years. There is neither crime nor offence when the accused was in a state of dementia at the time of the act. Hear that for what it does, rather than for what it sounds like. It does not say the accused is forgiven or excused or treated with mercy. It says there is no crime. The offence is cancelled at the level of its definition, so nothing is left for a court to establish. The second document on the table is a manuscript of about 300 pages, written in 1985. Its author wanted to give the account that the article had made it impossible for him to give. Before either document, a person. Hélène Ritman-Légotien was born in 1910, 8 years older than Althusser. She was Jewish, and during the occupation she was active in the resistance in Lyon. There she took the name Légotien, and she used it for the rest of her life. She had worked on the communist films of the Popular Front years, on La vie est à nous and on La Marseillaise. Her relation to the Communist Party was one of exclusion rather than membership. She was refused entry, and Althusser spent years failing to get that reversed and failing to rehabilitate her reputation. She was also a novelist. Around 1948, she submitted a novel of the resistance to Gallimard, provisionally titled Passé Simple. The manuscript is lost. What survives in an archive is the letter of refusal Camus wrote her, and her reply. From 1959 to 1975, she worked as a social scientist, running development studies in rural France and in Francophone Africa. She published on agricultural economics and on African education. She was killed on 16th November 1980 in the apartment inside the school on the Rue d'Ulm. They had been together 30 years, and she had decided to leave. Hold that asymmetry for a moment, because it is not a symbol. Her own book is gone, and the letter rejecting it is catalogued. The notebooks he kept as a prisoner of war in Germany were published in the same period by the archive that holds his papers. That is what a record looks like when it has been kept by one side. What happened next is the reason this part exists. He did not go to the police, and the police did not come for him. By the usual account, he went to the school's physician, who called the psychiatric authorities. He was taken to Sainte-Anne Hospital, and he was never in ordinary criminal custody at all. The medical background was on file, and it was long. In June 1980, after an operation for a hiatus hernia, he went into acute melancholia. He was put on Neomid, an early antidepressant, and when he did not respond, the dose was doubled. He lost urinary and motor control, could not eat without vomiting, and suffered waking dreams of suicidal compulsion. 5 months later, Hélène Rittmann-Légotien was dead. A panel of psychiatrists found severe depression and hallucinations caused by his own treatment. 3 court-appointed experts concluded that he had been in a state of dementia at the time of the facts. In early 1981, an investigating magistrate ordered a non-lieu. Now, put that beside the thesis this whole video has been built on. Althusser's claim is that the subject is the constitutive category of ideology. The subject means the free agent, the centre of initiatives, the person who authors his acts and answers for them. The legal person is the purest specimen of it. And in early 1981, the French state, in writing, determined that Louis Althusser was not one. The tempting reading is irony, the theory arriving on its author's own body. The correct reading is worse than irony. The scene you have been carrying since the first hour runs on a call and a turn. Someone shouts in the street, a person turns, and in turning becomes somebody who can be addressed and answered and charged. Now remove one element. Here the call never comes. Nobody reads him a charge, no plea is entered, and no one at any stage asks him whether he did it. There is no moment of turning round, because nobody calls. What the apparatus does instead is examine him. Experts, a file, a conclusion, and then on the strength of that file, a declaration that there was no crime. The category of the person who cannot be tried is not a hole in the machinery. It is a position the machinery contains and assigns, and psychiatry is the state apparatus that fills it. So the chair is empty again, and this time on purpose. Earlier, the emptiness was structural. Nobody in the author's seat, nobody who signed the script. Here, the state keeps a seat empty deliberately, the seat of the accused who is declared to have no case. Article 64 did not say he was excused. It said there was no crime. And that was not an exit from ideology. The state keeps a place for the person it declines to call a subject. He was put in it, and he called it a tombstone of silence. There is an argument you may be holding right now, and it should be stated in its strongest form first. History, for Althusser, is a process without a subject, and individuals are the supports of structural relations rather than their authors. If no one is an author, no act can be imputed to anyone. So the theory excuses the killing. That argument fails, and it fails on one word. The word is author. When Althusser says history has no author, he is saying that what explains a historical transformation is not somebody's intention. It is not the intentions of man, or of a class conceived as a giant person. When the objection says nobody is an author, it is saying no person ever did anything. Those are two different claims, and the first does not give you the second. Saying the causes of inflation are not the intentions of shoppers does not mean no shopper ever bought anything. And the essay itself defines the subject as the author of its actions, and as responsible for them. That is the content of the category being analysed, not a fiction being abolished. Which leaves a hole, and the hole is real. If the subject is constituted by structures and is nevertheless the author of acts, somebody owes an account of how both hold. Althusser never wrote it. The theory does not excuse, and it also has no theory of imputation, and both of those need saying together. Now, the argument that depends on none of this. A criminal trial is a public procedure for establishing what happened and for giving the victim's side standing to be heard. The non-lieu ended the procedure before any of that. There is no verdict and no finding of fact, and nobody has standing in the room except the accused and his doctors. Then, in March 1985, Claude Sarraute, a columnist in Le Monde, compared his case to that of Issei Sagawa, another notorious killer. Her line was that the victim does not get 3 lines, while the guilty man is the star. Friends of his later said the column was what pushed him to write. The result was the manuscript on the table, 300 pages, in which he is the star. So the only sustained first-person account of her death is by the man who caused it. It was produced to correct the record about himself, and it has been read ever since. If you know anything about how she died, you know it from him. Geraldine Finn pushes further, and her version should not be softened. The philosophy and the act are not separable at all, as her argument is usually summarized. The obvious reply is that no theory of history entails a domestic killing. And there is direct counter-evidence. Laura Mulvey and Judith Butler built feminist work on interpolation. But Finn's claim is not that the theory caused the hands. It is that abolishing the vocabulary of the human abolishes something else along with it. On that reading, it removes the words in which a victim appears as a wronged person rather than as the support of a relation. That points straight at the missing account, and it has not been answered. 2 corrections, and neither is offered as mitigation. The ruling rested on a provision that predated him by 108 years. It had been applied to thousands of ordinary defendants, and nothing in it refers to his ideas. His biographer, Jan Moulier-Boutang, worked through the medical record and did the arithmetic. Althusser had to be hospitalized, on average, once every 3 years, and depression immobilized, perhaps half his working life. And he did not walk free. He spent much of the following decade in compulsory hospitalization, medicated. Both facts are here because the alternatives are false. The story in which his philosophy got him off is wrong about what actually happened. Over the last decade, the scholarship has changed what it calls this. It was the Althusser affair. It is now the femicide of Hélène Rietmann-Legotien. William Lewis refuses the choice between reading the philosophy alone and reducing it to a pathology. His conclusion is narrow and hard to escape. Anyone who goes on using the work carries a standing obligation to name the killing. The whole of this part has turned on a subject that gets made and then gets held to what it did. The making is theorized, the holding is not. And if the theory cannot say how a made subject can be answerable, it cannot say how one can refuse. Refusing is an act with an author inside it. And on that, the theory says nothing at all. Whatever comes next will have to arrive without it. Part 11. What refusing actually does. You have refused things. You left the church you were raised in, or the party, or the family plan, or the job that was chosen for you before you were old enough to object. It cost you a relationship, or a room you are no longer invited into, or 10 years of ease. You did it with your eyes open, and it is a large part of who you take yourself to be. So ask coldly what it moved. Start with the worst answer, because everything after this has to beat it. 3 premises are already on the table. Ideology has no outside, so there is no clearing to step into. There is no human essence underneath, no pre-ideological version of a person waiting to be uncovered once the installed material is stripped off. And the subject form is itself the product of the address. The one who did the refusing was issued by the same operation that installed what it refused. Put those together and the conclusion is hard. The instrument you audit your convictions with arrived in the same box as the convictions. There is a measurement of what a change of mind buys, and this video already took it. 12 million Dutch letters moved the consent rate by nothing, and Austria, which argues with nobody, sits at almost 100%. The form is filled in that way before anyone reaches it. The philosopher who priced refusal most exactly is barely known outside the field. Michel Pecheux worked on discourse in Althusser's orbit. In 1975, as his readers reconstruct it, he set out 3 ways a person can stand toward the formation that produced them. The first is identification. The good subject overlaps with the dominant formation almost perfectly and takes its obviousness for his own free thought. The second is counter-identification. The bad subject turns the discourse round and says no, refuses it, distances himself, argues with it item by item. And Pecheux's finding about that position is what the rest of this part has to answer. The man who left the party and now measures every political question by what the party would have said is still being organized by the party. The third modality has no popular name. Pecheux calls it disidentification, and it names a change in the position itself. The subject form gets worked on and transformed by another practice, a scientific one or a political one. The old positions stop being available in the same way. The displacement is real, and it is never an escape. Disidentification is something a person undergoes, driven by practices outside them, over time. Nobody performs it in the street by deciding to. which brings the street back for the last time. A voice behind you calls out, and you turn 180 degrees before you have decided anything. Furious or not, you turned. What would have made a difference is nothing that happens in the 2 seconds after the shout. It is what you were standing inside before it. A union, a trade, an organization, a discipline that had already reworked what turning means and what a person there does next. So the question was never whether your refusal was sincere enough. You do not get out by disagreeing. Refusal is the same ground with a minus sign in front of it, and what actually changes a person is a change of address. Now, the 2 strongest attempts to give more back than that, both put as strongly as they can be put. The first is Judith Butler's In the Psychic Life of Power from 1997. Power has to produce a subject in order to have one, since there is nothing there to dominate otherwise. Producing a subject means giving it a psychic life, an attachment, a conscience, a relation to itself, and that psychic life is not exhausted by the norm that installed it. Normalization always leaves a remainder it could not metabolize. So the child who is named before birth and placed before it exists also acquires from that very installation the capacity to refuse the name. The capacity was not smuggled in from some outside. It was issued by the apparatus, which is why the apparatus cannot fully collect it. The second is Stuart Hall's from 1985, and it moves the question off the individual entirely. Hall's premise is that ideological elements carry no class belonging written into them. The word family has no politics of its own, and neither does freedom, and neither does work. Their political meaning comes from the chain they are currently linked into. Chains are made and broken by political labour rather than guaranteed by the economy. So the same element can be won for opposite projects and has been repeatedly inside a single decade. On Hall's account, leverage re-enters the theory as a linkage that was never guaranteed. Somebody working at it can undo the link, which is a job rather than an insight. Both of those are weaker than they sound. Butler's argument turns entirely on the premise that normalization leaves a remainder, and that premise is asserted rather than derived. Nothing earlier in her chain produces it. Worse, the guilt and the compulsion that make her account of the turn work are imported into Althusser rather than found there. His text never grounds the answer to the Hail in conscience to the degree she needs. What is left is a promissory note for a freedom nobody has yet cashed. Hall pays a different bill. Push no necessary correspondence far enough, as Laclos and Mouffe did, and class determination dissolves altogether. The theory has then bought its openness by surrendering the explanation of reproduction that made it worth having. And then there is the consolation this part has been circling, the one almost everybody takes from Butler without reading further. The idea that the part of you which does not fit is the free part. Žižek, writing in 1989, describes exactly that leftover and then says the opposite about it. There is always a residue, he argues, a strain of traumatic irrationality, a senseless sticking to it. And that leftover, far from getting in the way of full submission, is what makes full submission possible. Sit with that. Sticking to what? To the identity itself. There is an attachment you cannot justify and would defend hardest. It is the enjoyment that glues you to the identity, and it is why the identity holds. That is bleaker than Althusser, not more hopeful, and nobody should leave this part thinking otherwise. Even the repair has an open question inside it. Whether disidentification is a real mechanism or only a name for one is genuinely unsettled, because Pessoa describes the outcome far better than the process. Bruno Bostiles notices something odd in the record. Rancière, who spent a career attacking the Althusserians, defines political subjectification as disidentification, removal from the naturalness of a place. The enemy kept the word. Every answer this part has offered is a change of position inside an arrangement that already exists. The union is there to be joined, the discipline there to be entered, the practice there to be stood inside. But nobody built that arrangement on purpose either, and the current one renews itself every morning without anyone running it. So where does a genuinely different arrangement come from? Part 12. The encounter that did not have to happen. Rain, not weather. Atoms falling through empty space in parallel lines, at the same speed forever, never touching. That is the picture Lucretius inherited from Epicurus, and it is where Althusser starts. Parallel fall is the quietest disaster in philosophy. If everything falls straight, nothing ever meets anything, so there is no relation, no event, and no world. Then one atom swerves. Nothing makes it swerve, and nothing decides whether it will. It leans a fraction sideways, strikes another, and a chain of collisions begins that has never stopped. 3 sentences of honesty first, because both sides of the fight over these texts lean on them. The writings are drafts, made between 1982 and 1986 by a man moving in and out of psychiatric hospitals. The central essay was carved by his editor François Matterrand out of a much longer, repetitive manuscript on which Althusser had written the word definitive. And he never published any of it. That does not make the material unserious. It does mean one kind of sentence is ruled out. Any sentence that begins, Althusser finally admitted it. He never released the admission, so there is nothing to admit into evidence. Now the question these drafts are answering. The economy you work in looks like the end of a sequence. Feudalism grew into markets, markets grew into industry, industry grew into whatever this is, and each stage carried the next inside it like a seed. That story is comforting in both directions. It makes the present the outcome of an argument already settled, and it promises that the next stage is being carried somewhere now. The question is what entitles anyone to the seed. Althusser's answer is that forms come last, not first. A structure, a state, a mode of production, a subject. Each one is a composite left behind by a meeting that already happened. None of them is a template waiting for elements to arrive and fill it. Part 2 laid out the 3 separate histories that had to run into each other before capitalism existed, none of them aiming at it. The premise doing the work is this one. If an element has its own history, made without reference to the whole it later joins, then it cannot contain that whole in advance. Money piled up by a merchant does not contain capitalism. A worker with nothing to sell but their hours does not contain a revolution. Which brings up the concept almost nobody teaches, and it is the one that matters. Althusser calls it the take. An encounter has 3 possible fates. It can fail to happen, which is the parallel reign. It can happen and not take, meaning the elements meet, nothing sets, and they disperse. Or it can take hold, the way milk takes, the way ice takes, the way a grafted branch takes on a trunk. Whether the milk sets is uncertain. Once it has set, you cannot get the milk back, and everybody knows that asymmetry from a kitchen. Only after a take does necessity exist, and it genuinely exists. This is the part readers get wrong when they hear contingency and think everything has gone loose. Inside a mode of production that has taken, the laws are hard, the reproduction is real, and the school sorts the cohort every year without fail. Everything the last 11 parts described, the apparatus, the ritual, the practice you perform without deciding anything, is a description of the inside of a take. The bell still rings at the same hour in a building that was put up by people who are dead. Here is the case Althusser himself keeps reaching for. Northern Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries had the money, the merchants, the banking technique, and the trade routes. It also had cities packed with people who had lost their land. On the seed story, this is the cradle, and the rest is a matter of time. It did not happen. On his telling, the elements were present they met, and nothing congealed. The capital went into land, into luxury, and into lending to princes. Historians argue about this case. The strongest rival account explains the Italian failure by who controlled the land and on what terms, which is a cause rather than an absent meeting. But on Althusser's reading, the sequence you were taught as inevitable had a rehearsal elsewhere, and it did not run. So here is what the necessity around you actually is. It is real, and it is dated. It began on the day an encounter took. From inside it there is no visible seam, because the take does one more thing after it sets. It projects itself backwards. It rewrites everything that preceded it as preparation for itself, so that the world arrives already looking intended. Which gives politics its model here, and the model is Machiavelli, writing instructions for a prince he cannot name in a place he cannot name. He can specify everything the founder of a unified Italy would need: the courage, the arms of his own, the favourable moment, the ground. The theory is complete, and the outcome is still not entailed. You can raise the odds. You cannot guarantee the meeting, and no amount of preparation turns the odds into a promise. Everything you have just been handed rests on one claim, and the claim is disputed. If the late drafts only rename what Althusser was already saying 20 years earlier, then the start date is not something he discovered at the end. So the fight in the literature is worth exactly one question. Do these writings say anything the earlier ones did not? Antonio Negri read them in 1993 and called it a reversal, because the old vocabulary of science, break and structure is simply gone. Goshgarian, who translated them, dates the same ideas back to a study of Montesquieu in 1959. Morfino finds both strands fighting inside the drafts themselves, which means the clean version of this story does not exist. None of that touches the dating. Whether the thought was written in 1959 or 1982, the necessity you live in still began somewhere. The objection that does cost you something comes from Warren Montag, and it is aimed at the relief itself. He agrees the encounter is there early, which means the encounter cannot be what is new in the late work. What is new on his published argument, as it has been summarized, is a return to a philosophy of origins. A void sits at the start, and it functions as a guarantee that everything which exists will pass away. A guarantee that all orders end is a promise, and a promise lodged at the origin is the shape of a theology. Montag has been read as charging the late writings with a residual messianism they never examine. On that one axis, this work is less materialist than the work it was supposed to correct. There is also a plainer objection that needs no archive at all. The doctrine rests on a step that looks obvious and is not. Althusser argues that because no element carries the destiny of the whole, the conjunction must be aleatory. A critic can grant the first half and refuse the second. Elements have dispositions, real causal powers that make some meetings enormously more likely than others, and that is not teleology. Gunpowder does not intend the explosion. If that holds, the choice between a plan and a coin toss was never the only choice. Capitalism was then neither written in advance nor a fluke. Stefano Pippa presses from the other end, and his version costs the most. He argues that contingency was inside structural causality from the beginning, in the 1960s, in the very text read for decades as iron determinism. So the openness is genuine, and it is old. Then he adds the warning that removes the comfort. The structure comes apart at points nobody occupies. No one is standing there to notice the gap, and no one is standing there to use it. It is openness with nobody at the opening, which is where the good news, if there is any, has to be found. So take the objections at their worst. Suppose the encounter was there from 1959, a promise is hiding at the origin, and nobody is standing at the gaps. One thing still survives, and it is the thing the last 11 parts were built out of. In Part 2, the theatre had no author's chair, and that was maddening, because there was nobody to defeat. In Part 4, the same emptiness was how a school could sort 15-year-olds and have the sorting read as a verdict on persons. Now, the empty chair is the only good news the philosophy contains. Nothing wrote this, so nothing underwrites it, and a play with no author can stop being performed. That is an honest position rather than a resolution. The encounter that would undo the one you live inside is exactly as unguaranteed as the one that made it. Nothing here entitles anyone to expect it. Machiavelli waited for a prince who never came. What the argument does give you is smaller and harder. The necessity you were taught to call the way things are has a start date. And the question you can actually answer about yourself was never, what do I believe? It is, what am I standing inside?